It all started with the sharp sound of rubber exploding under my tires and the sudden horrifying jolt that nearly sent my morning coffee flying into my lap. And in those shocking 10 seconds my driveway went from a peaceful private path into a war zone packed with tiny metal teeth waiting to chew up anything that dared roll across them, and while most people would panic or scream or wonder what kind of horror movie they just drove into, I simply whispered one name under my breath, knowing exactly who was behind this mess before my heart even stopped racing for the first time: Karen, because if there is one thing an HOA Karen loves more than controlling others' lives, it is creating drama where there does not need to be any. And this time her drama was coated in steel spikes laid perfectly across my property, like she was mounting a military roadblock, as if I were a threat to national security just for trying to use my own driveway. And while I stared at the damage she had caused, I remembered how this all started a few weeks ago when I announced to the neighborhood that I was going to rebuild the old charity barn at the edge of my ranch to help local kids learn woodworking and raise funds through community events, and how everyone cheered except of course our beloved nightmare neighbor, who insisted that such a project would bring dust, soil, garbage, and dangerous tools near her precious manicured lawn, like she was guarding the gate of heaven from the hands of working-class peasants. And though I tried to keep my distance from her ever since she once tried to fine me for painting my barn a shade of red not approved in the HOA rulebook, that does not even apply to my land, because I am one of the lucky few who live right outside their jurisdiction, yet close enough that Karen believes she owns the air that crosses over property lines. She saw my driveway, which she uses every day to shortcut to the main road, and decided it belonged to her or should be controlled by her. Or at least used to punish me for daring to improve the community without her permission. But what she did not expect is that I am not some pushover suburban dad terrified of confrontation, because I happen to own something she never could stomach seeing in my yard: a old, but fully functional bulldozer that I have been restoring for exactly the kind of land clearing work my barn project requires, and while she mocked it, and called it a useless hunk of metal, the very sight of it will soon turn her world upside down, though she has no clue yet. So as I crouched down examining the spikes, I noticed something even more unbelievable hidden under them: tiny motion sensors linked to a cheap but noisy siren, meaning she wanted to not only destroy tires but catch me in the act of daring to use my own land, so she could somehow report me for something she invented in her mind and claim victory at the HOA board meeting, even though none of them control anything here really, but they still pretend wearing name badges like they are some small government military. And as I took pictures of everything calmly for future use, she suddenly burst out of her house, sprinting like a furious goose, honking orders, waving her phone in my face, yelling that she had video evidence of me damaging her property, and that she would have me arrested for trespassing on my own driveway. And I stood there trying not to laugh, because I realized this was going to be bigger than just spikes. This was going to be a fight over who actually owns this road and whether entitlement or reality will win. And little did she know that I already held the winning card, because years ago, when the previous owners foreclosed, I secretly purchased this driveway as its own parcel during a small auction, which was the best accidental decision of my life, because now, as she ranted about her authority and HOA laws that definitely do not exist, I knew exactly how this story would end, with her screaming, while my bulldozer crushed every single spike she had so proudly planted, and watching her jaw drop into the grass. But I also knew I had to play this smart, because if I reveal my trump card too soon, the fun will end too quickly, and if there is one thing I enjoy more than a peaceful morning coffee, it is watching a bully dig their own grave with the shovel of stupidity while believing they are building a palace. So I let her scream and record and threaten lawsuits while I pretended to be confused and panicked, just enough to keep her ego inflated, because when this goes down I want the pop to echo across the whole neighborhood, and for every neighbor to witness exactly what happens when someone tries to tell me what I can do on my own land. So with tires flattened and a smirk forming at the corner of my mouth, I walked back toward my house, knowing this was only chapter 1 of a story where a woman who thought she ruled the road put her trust in spikes that would soon become nothing but crumbs beneath the unstoppable tracks of justice rumbling toward her in the form of my bulldozer. The next morning began with the sound of Karen's ridiculous fake police siren blaring from one of the brand new cameras she mounted overnight along the bushes of my driveway, as if she were monitoring a high-security border between nations, and the sight instantly pushed me from amused curiosity into full-blown disbelief, because she had not only doubled down on her madness, she had multiplied it while the rest of us slept like sane humans, and I stood there rubbing my eyes trying to wrap my head around how someone could purchase this much surveillance equipment faster than most people buy cereal while convinced she was protecting the world from a homeowner trying to access his own property. And right there in the sunlight her little sparkling poodle named Princess Pink Sparkle pranced around in a neon yellow vest labeled Official Security Dog, which would have been adorable if Karen had not attached a tiny GoPro to the dog's head like she was sending it on a reconnaissance mission into enemy territory. Meanwhile she strutted behind the dog like a general leading troops into battle, except her troops were two overpriced lawn ornaments with Bluetooth radios screwed into them, which she insisted were patrol units that recorded tire pressure and vehicle speed, and could report me directly to the HLA headquarters, which according to her existed in a secret underground office beneath the clubhouse where the board made decisions to keep people like me from ruining civilization, and honestly, I was tempted to applaud her creativity, if it wasn't aimed like a missile straight into my driveway rights. So instead I took out my phone and walked slowly recording every detail from the cameras illegally pointing into my yard to the ridiculous sign she nailed at the very edge of my fence claiming that this route was HOA authorized pathway and any violator would be fined up to $5,000, which she cannot actually enforce, but she printed the sign in a dramatic font that tried very hard to look like a government warning. But as I filmed her theatrics she noticed me and came marching with the righteous fury of someone whose coffee was brewed with pure entitlement, shouting that my behavior was unacceptable and I must turn around before committing another crime of misuse of community road access, which again is hilarious because this road is not and never has been a community property and belongs entirely to me thanks to the best foreclosure auction in history. But I continued filming and politely asked her if she installed these devices because there seemed to be something wrong with the spikes yesterday, and that tiny bit of reverse psychology opened a floodgate of boastful nonsense where she proudly explained every trap she had set to prevent my trucks from destroying what she called pristine public access, and how she was gathering a mountain of evidence for the lawyer she had retained who would soon evict me from my own driveway and force me to find a legal landing strip for my bulldozer because apparently heavy machinery in the presence of a suburban queen is an atrocity, and I smiled and nodded pretending to be terrified while actually thrilled because every word she spoke became another nail in her legal coffin once the truth is unveiled. And the best part was how she mentioned a rumor she started claiming that my charity barn project was actually a secret attempt to create a mini industrial plant that would pollute the neighborhood and cause property values to plummet, which made some of my neighbors anxious until I invited them over for a barbecue last week and showed them the detailed community plans I drew up that included fundraising spaces, kid-friendly workshops, and weekend farmers market zones, and they all loved it and volunteered to help, but Karen refused to attend, claiming she would rather hold a meeting with people of better standards, which is hilarious since last week she tried to fine her own husband for leaving a garden hose out one night, but she kept ranting while I remembered that this area had once been a private ranch long before any HOA came along, and the old owner, who fell behind on taxes, let the property go into bank ownership, and I bought the parcel with the driveway for less than Karen spent on 2 months of glittery poodle grooming, which still feels like the universe blessing me for future entertainment. So while she pointed at me and yelled the words trespasser and violator, 2 cops quietly drove by doing routine patrol and saw the commotion and slowed their car just enough that Karen sprinted over, waving her hands dramatically, claiming I was trying to break into my own home, and they looked at me confused, and when I calmly showed them the land deed on my phone with the parcel highlighted, their faces went from curiosity to trying very hard not to laugh in her face, especially when I politely asked if installing road spikes on someone else's private driveway counts as a crime, and the Officer replied that it absolutely does, and that those needed to be removed immediately or she would face serious consequences, which made her freeze like someone unplugged her brain for a second before she started blaming me for tricking her into thinking she owned the road. But the officer simply raised an eyebrow and asked her how one gets tricked into hammering metal spikes into land they never purchased, and she sputtered insults and pointed fingers, but the officers gave her a stern warning and left while she scrambled to turn off her fake sirens and pretend everything was under control, though inside her mind I could see panic swirling because things were not going according to her delusional master plan. And as soon as the police left, she stormed inside without another word, leaving her security dog to chase butterflies while I stood there grinning at what was coming next, because the bulldozer restoration was nearly finished, and once I fire that beast up and roll down this driveway, there will be nothing she can do to stop me from crushing every spike, camera alarm, and ego-filled obstacle she tries to throw at me. And for the first time I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the coffee spill, and the tire bill, and the fake sirens at dawn, and I decided she fully deserved what the bulldozer was going to deliver very soon, which made me laugh out loud, loudly enough that Princess Pink Sparkle tilted her head like she sensed justice in the air. The funniest part about Karen's meltdown was that instead of quietly backing down after police left, she decided to go full detective mode on me, as if she was cracking a high-level criminal conspiracy, and the next morning I woke up to see her pacing outside with a folder full of printouts clutched in her hand, wild hair flying everywhere, and I knew she had spent the entire night digging into anything she could find to justify her actions, but the sheer determination on her face almost made me admire her stubborn lunacy until she opened her mouth and demanded that I show her a permit for my bulldozer, because heavy equipment on residential land apparently needed HOA approval. That again did not apply to me, but she was convinced she had found some kind of loophole that would finally shut me down, and she dramatically slammed a stack of neighborhood bylaws onto the hood of my truck like she was serving a warrant from the Supreme Court, even though half the rules were handwritten notes she scribbled in highlighter. And while she ranted, I noticed a new addition to her growing fortress, a cheap chain-link mini-gate she had hammered crookedly into the side of the driveway, lined with bright plastic road cones, each labeled private passage only, but they were positioned so poorly a toddler on a tricycle could wiggle through, which made me laugh out loud, prompting her to shout that laughter was an admission of guilt, and that I should prepare for the HOA disciplinary committee, of which she was the self-declared chair of future bylaws, which she said gave her temporary emergency authority to enforce drafted rules until the board approved them, which sounded like something she invented 5 minutes ago in the shower. And as she shoved a paper into my chest claiming it was an official stop work order signed by her, I politely asked her if she purposely omitted the address, her name, and the date, or whether the pen ran out of ink before she finished, and she huffed, running back toward her house, yelling that she would return with real documents and witnesses, and that she would spend the rest of her life making sure I never built anything ever again. Meanwhile, Princess Pink Sparkle dragged a piece of the chain-link fence away like it was a chew toy, and that was when I realized Karen was officially losing this war one screw at a time, because everything she built physically or legally fell apart faster than she could invent new rules. But while she spiraled in chaos, I remained calm, quietly preparing for the big reveal. So I contacted my friend Mark, who happened to be a licensed land surveyor, and also the guy who originally helped me buy this driveway parcel years ago when the old ranch was chopped up into smaller lots, and he arrived that afternoon with maps, surveys, and official forms, all neatly stamped with government seals, the kind Karen worships like holy scripture, and we double-checked every boundary, confirming the obvious that her cameras, spikes, fences, and cones were all blatantly trespassing onto my property, which meant once I chose to take legal action, she would owe thousands in damages or easily face criminal charges. And the more we went through the paperwork, the more excited Mark became as he imagined the HOA meltdown this would cause, especially since the access road that Karen and multiple neighbors use daily actually belongs to me entirely, meaning technically they should have requested permission from me to drive across it for the past year, which I Always allowed because I am not a monster, but now that Karen turned it into a battlefield, I had every right to install a payroll-style toll booth and charge her each time she passed or block her entirely, which made me grin imagining her tantrum as she realized her shortcut to the main road was not a right but a privilege hanging by a thread. And while we plotted the perfect way to present this information at the most humiliating moment for her, Karen desperately tried to rally support by hosting a dramatic emergency HOA street meeting with folding chairs and a big poster that read "Save our neighborhood from heavy machinery pollution," where she screamed that my bulldozer would poison the air, cause uncontrollable dust storms, and attract dangerous wild animals like raccoons, foxes, or even cows, as if cows were some terrifying beasts planning revenge on her rose bushes, and she told everyone I was secretly trying to convert the charity barn into a mega factory that would churn out harmful chemicals and illegal tractor parts, and that soon the entire place would be a wasteland of rust and chaos if nobody stopped me. But to her shock, most neighbors gave her confused looks and reminded her that I had invited them to help build the barn and that it was actually for a children's program she rudely refused to attend. And one neighbor even asked if her issue was less about pollution and more about jealousy, since the community loved the project and not her petty flower show last year. That only 3 people attended, one of them being herself twice, and when they challenged her she threw a tantrum accusing them all of betrayal and stormed away, dragging her security dog, whose GoPro was now recording nothing but the ground because Karen accidentally taped it facing downward. And after that humiliating attempt for support, she retreated to her house and turned off the blinds like she was retreating to a war bunker, but that did not stop her from spying, since she cut a tiny square hole in the curtain, which was super obvious, and the neighbors laughed every time her eye peeked through. Yet despite losing allies, she was still dangerous because she refused to give up, and that made me more determined to finish this the right way. So I began preparing the bulldozer for its grand entrance, cleaning the tracks, checking the engine, tightening every bolt, because when that machine rolls down the driveway it must do so with style, power, and the roar of inevitable justice. But the funniest twist of the day came when Mark and I walked the border of the driveway and noticed a fresh stack of paperwork taped to one of her cameras, a cease and desist order printed off the internet, full of typos and threats that made absolutely no legal sense whatsoever, like "remove your equipment and leave the driveway or the community will reclaim dominion," which sounded like a line stolen from a medieval castle siege, and below it in bold markers she wrote "Trespassers will be filmed violently," which both confused and entertained us, because did she mean the act would be violent or the filming technique would be violent? Nobody could tell, and while laughing at that, Mark looked at me and said she is gifting us a comedy show and does not even know it. And as the sun set I stood there staring at those spikes, imagining how satisfying it would be when every single one collapses beneath 20,000 pounds of steel, and how Karen's scream would echo across the neighborhood louder than her fake siren ever did, and how that moment would finally mark the end of this ridiculous war of entitlement versus ownership. And I promised myself that when that bulldozer rolls, the entire neighborhood will witness the unstoppable truth that you cannot block someone from their own property just because you woke up one day and decided you are queen of the cul-de-sac. And with that satisfying thought in mind, I locked the shop doors and went to sleep, excited for the chaos tomorrow might bring, because I was done playing defense, and it was time for the dozer to speak in the only language Karen understands, loud, unstoppable, and crushing right through her delusions. The next day began with the kind of peace that only exists right before a storm, because I woke up smiling, knowing that today was the day Karen would discover a truth she never imagined in her wildest HOA fantasies. And while I sipped my coffee staring out the window, I watched her pacing her yard frantically with a clipboard, shouting into a walkie-talkie that connected to absolutely nobody, acting like she was leading a tactical military operation instead of a neighborhood temper tantrum. And I could see from a distance that she had now added 2 more warning signs to the edge of my driveway, one that said HOA controlled zone and another that said no unauthorized construction equipment allowed, with a tiny drawing of a bulldozer in a red circle with a line through it. And I almost choked on my drink laughing because she seriously thought a doodle could stop a machine built to move mountains, but I kept calm and headed outside with the most casual attitude imaginable, acting like nothing in the world was wrong, because nothing beats watching an entitled person panic when their threats are ignored. And as I approached the driveway, Karen came storming across the grass, yelling that today was the deadline she had given me to remove the bulldozer from the neighborhood or prepare for extreme consequences, and she waved a folder at me stuffed with papers that were clearly printed from random legal websites, although she tried to make them look official by stamping them with a craft store ink pad that left glittery stars all over the page, as if the state court had suddenly adopted a kindergarten aesthetic. And while she yelled about permits, environmental dangers, legal restrictions, and some imaginary ordinance about maximum horsepower allowed near a sidewalk, I calmly pulled out one single sheet of paper that held more power than all her glittering nonsense combined: the certified survey map, with bold legal markings showing that the entire driveway, including every single spike, camera, pipe, cone, and piece of fencing she installed, was legally my private land. And the moment I handed that paper to her, her face twisted like a balloon, losing air one wrinkle at a time, and she refused to look at it, claiming she did not need to see fraudulent documents created by criminals, and that the HOA had assured her verbally that this road was community-controlled, which of course was a lie she invented, but she clung to it like it was her last lifeline, even though the truth was now glowing in her hands. And I asked her directly, did you pay for this driveway? Did you sign any deed showing ownership? Did you ever check property records before drilling spikes into the ground? And the silence that followed was the most glorious silence to ever grace this neighborhood, because her mouth opened but no words came out, only the sound of pure fear and disbelief escaping in tiny gasps, while Princess Pink Sparkle sniffed the survey map as if she understood the victory better than her owner. And I calmly explained that the previous owner lost the ranch to foreclosure years ago, and the bank sold off the road separately at auction, a fact she never bothered to investigate because she assumed anything she touched magically belonged to her, which meant every time she drove across this driveway without permission I was being generous by allowing her to do so, and that generosity was about to come to an end. And her eyes widened as she suddenly realized that not only did she lose control over my project, she might lose access to the only fast exit to the highway, forcing her to drive an extra 10 minutes through bumpy back roads. And the panic hit her like lightning, because entitlement cannot function with inconvenience. And instead of apologizing like a reasonable person, she exploded into accusations, saying that I bought the driveway just to torment her, that I tricked everyone by hiding the deed, and that I planned this from the beginning like some mastermind villain. And honestly, it felt good to be seen as a genius for once, even by a delusional person. And while she screamed, I simply smiled and walked to the garage, where the rumble of my bulldozer roared to life, shaking the ground with a sound that perfectly matched the march of justice coming her way. And the moment she heard the engine, she sprinted toward her house, screaming to activate the blockade plan, which made me picture her flipping a big red switch that controls nothing but her imagination, because all she really had was a fragile gate and a few cones held together by zip ties and hope. And as the bulldozer rolled forward, slowly stacking tension with each loud clank of the metal tracks, neighbors peeked out from windows and porches whispering excitement, because they knew this was not just construction, this was a moment of reckoning, and some even brought lawn chairs and snacks like they were front row at a summer show. And honestly, I felt proud to provide such a thrilling event free of charge. And when I finally reached the first line of spikes, I paused, letting the engine growl intimidatingly as Karen emerged wearing a construction vest 3 sizes too small, holding a clipboard in one hand and a tiny whistle in the other, yelling cease movement like I was a bulldog and she was the dog trainer. But before she could blow that whistle, I raised my phone, pressed play, and the speakers blasted a dramatic soundtrack like a superhero entrance, because if we were doing this, we were doing it with style. and then I gently eased forward and steel tracks met steel spikes in a crushing embrace that ended instantly, the spikes flattened like butter under a boot, popping out of the asphalt, snapping, launching, and splintering in every direction as the bulldozer crawled over them without hesitation, and the sound of destruction was the most satisfying crunch I have ever heard in my life, and the crowd of neighbors erupted with cheers that echoed across lawns, like a stadium celebrating a winning goal, while Karen screamed bloody murder like the spikes were her children being devoured by a monster, and she dropped to her knees dramatically shouting, why would you do this?" which sounded incredible considering she was the one who put them there. And as I continued driving forward, flattening every obstruction, she placed her face turned red, her sunglasses fell off, and she started flapping her arms like a malfunctioning windmill, yelling that I would pay for this, that the HOA would sue me, that I would lose everything by the end of the week, and I shrugged, telling her that I would love to see that happen in court, especially after I show the judge every picture, video map, and police report proving she vandalized private land and endangered motorists. And finally, when the last spike was destroyed, and the driveway lay open wide and free like it should have been from the start, I looked back at Karen, who was sobbing into her clipboard, while neighbors shook their heads laughing. And I realized this battle was not just about a driveway anymore. This was a lesson in boundaries, property rights, and the magnificent downfall of someone who tried to play queen but forgot the crown was imaginary. And as I parked the bulldozer proudly at the top of the drive, I knew this war was far from over, because Karen would not accept defeat so easily, and the next move was hers. But this time, every single person in the neighborhood was watching and rooting for justice to roll right over her. Entitlement again and again, until she finally gets the message. Karen may have lost the first battle, but she was nowhere near surrender, because the moment I parked the bulldozer, she stood up with the determination of a movie villain who refuses to die even after the credits roll. And she wiped tears and grass off her face, then pointed at me with a trembling finger, swearing that she had backup on the way, which made me almost choke laughing, because what backup could she possibly bring against 20,000 pounds of metal? But minutes later my amusement turned into pure entertainment when a black SUV pulled up like some elite squad arriving to defend the Queen, and out jumped three men dressed in overpriced tactical vests with security written across the front in giant letters, as if the font size proved authority, and they all stood in a triangle formation around Karen, while she bragged that she hired professional enforcement to ensure nobody used what she still called her road, even though that theory had already been crushed flatter than her road spikes under my bulldozer. And the security guards looked around confused, clearly wondering why they were called to protect a broken driveway, but Karen whispered urgently to them like she was narrating a hostage situation, explaining that I was a dangerous machinery operator trying to destroy community property, and they needed to stop me at all costs. And the tallest guard came up to me with the most serious face possible, asking whether I had authorization to operate heavy equipment on site. And I simply held up the land deed like presenting a royal decree, and said this is all the authorization I need, which made him squint at the document while Karen hovered behind him waving the glitter-stamped nonsense she printed from the internet, claiming mine was fake and hers was real. But the guard turned to her and asked if she actually owned the road, and for a moment she stuttered, realizing she could not lie directly because the police had already scolded her yesterday, so instead she tried to twist the truth, saying she represented the community, which technically was just herself but sounded official in her delusional dictionary, and the guard shrugged, unsure of what his job even was now, so he stepped aside, realizing there was no threat except Karen's hysteria. But she would not let the humiliation end there, and stomped toward the bulldozer, yelling that if the spikes were gone she would use bigger obstacles next time, and suddenly she signaled to the guards, who reluctantly dragged a massive chain from her yard and attempted to wrap it across the driveway, tying it to a couple of flimsy lawn stakes that would snap if a bicycle touched them, let alone a bulldozer. And as the chain rattled in place, Karen proudly folded her arms like she installed a drawbridge gate at a castle, and declared that nobody would pass, especially not criminals who commit driveway terrorism, which was her latest invented crime category. And I asked her calmly if she really wanted to do this. Again, because I am great at breaking things that block my driveway, and this bulldozer has a long appetite for metal today. But she screamed that if I dared move 1 inch she would call the police again and file property destruction charges, even though everything she put there was on my land. And I took a deep breath, trying to see how far she would go, when suddenly more neighbors emerged recording on their phones, whispering commentary like this was the season finale of a reality show. And then someone shouted, "We believe in the bulldozer," which made the whole crowd laugh, except Karen, who turned purple with rage. And instead of fueling the drama further, I decided it was time to escalate things in the most responsible and legally brilliant way possible, so I turned off the bulldozer for now and walked to my truck, pulling out a bright orange envelope that contained a document Karen never expected to receive, and I handed it to her, announcing that she was now officially being served with a notice to remove all trespassing installations within 24 hours, including spikes, cones, cameras, and chains, or face fines and legal action for vandalism and illegal obstruction of private property. And at first she thought it was a joke until she saw the county stamp and my land surveyor's signature at the bottom, and her jaw dropped again, like it was becoming a daily exercise routine, hundreds of neighbors filming every expression, and she ripped the notice in front of me, screaming that she would not follow any orders from low-class tyrants, which was ironic because she was the one trying to dictate rules to the entire community. And while she spiraled into another meltdown, the security guards quietly walked away one by one, realizing this was not a high-threat assignment but a babysitting job for a grown woman throwing a tantrum. And as they left, Karen demanded they stay and protect her property rights, to which one guard politely said, "Ma'am, this is not your property," and left her standing alone holding a broken chain, while Princess Pink Sparkle barked half-heartedly like even the dog was tired of the nonsense. And that moment of isolation cracked her ego harder than any bulldozer could, because suddenly she looked around and saw every neighbor watching her, not with fear but with pity and annoyance, and she realized she was losing the audience she cared more about than any driveway. Yet instead of admitting defeat, she tried to regain control by attempting the most ridiculous move yet. She marched toward her luxury SUV parked in front of my house and drove it directly into the center of the driveway, blocking it completely, then stepped out, triumphantly locking the doors, while shouting, "Blockade level maximum, nobody gets through, especially you," and she walked away like she had just placed a tank on a battlefield. And the crowd gasped, then cheered, because they all knew what I was thinking. A bulldozer may not respect chains, cones, or spikes, but a parked SUV was a whole new challenge, and they wanted to know what would happen next. And I smiled, because what Karen failed to realize was that I already prepared for this exact final boss move the moment I saw her panicked walkie-talkie nonsense earlier, and waiting around the corner was my backup, not security, not police, but my buddy Jake, who runs a towing company and owed me a favor after I helped him rebuild his garage last summer. And with perfect timing, his tow truck came roaring down the street like a wrestler entering the ring, and the crowd erupted again, laughing and cheering, while Jake leaned out the window yelling, "Did someone call for SUV removal?" And Karen froze mid-walk, turning around slowly like a villain caught by the camera before the jump scare, and she shrieked that nobody dare touch her vehicle, because it was worth more than all of our houses combined, and any attempt to move it would result in lawsuits from here to the moon. But Jake simply raised his gloves, smiled, and said, "Lady, this is private property and the owner requested removal, so the law is actually on our side." And Karen tried to unlock her doors to escape in the SUV, but her shaking hands fumbled the keys, buying us enough time for Jake to hook the tow line, and she screamed louder than ever like she was being fed to an alligator, while I stood back with arms crossed, knowing this was only the beginning of her full collapse, because now the bulldozer had a clear path ahead, and no obstacle she summoned could survive the wheels of justice rolling directly toward her fragile kingdom. The moment the tow truck started pulling Karen's SUV off my driveway, the entire neighborhood erupted into the kind of applause usually reserved for championship parades and newborn babies, and while Jake worked with the calm confidence of a man who has towed more entitled vehicles than he could count, I watched Karen scramble across the yard like a frantic cartoon villain trying to stop a train by yelling at it, her arms flailing like she was conducting an orchestra powered by pure panic, and she screamed at Jake claiming he was kidnapping her car and that she would report him to the FBI, CIA, HOA and NASA because apparently space agencies care deeply about driveway drama. But Jake simply patted the SUV gently and said, "Don't worry baby, we are taking you somewhere much nicer than this driveway war zone," before securing the final hook and driving off while Karen sprinted behind the truck yelling, "Bring her back you mechanical thief," until she tripped over her own chain and face planted into the grass, which made half the audience gasp and the other half laugh behind their phones because by now this battle was a full-blown viral reality show, and as Karen slowly stood up, grass stuck to her hair and clothes like camouflage gone wrong, she pointed at me with fury and shrieked that I had unleashed chaos and that the entire community would pay dearly for applauding my lawlessness, then stormed inside, slamming the door with such force a decorative wreath fell off and landed on her porch. Like even the decorations had given up on her sanity, and while she was plotting her next disaster I noticed a group of neighbors walking toward me, clapping me on the back and congratulating me not for winning a petty fight but for standing up to someone who had bullied everyone here for years by reporting harmless things like mismatched flower pots, trash cans visible from the street, and kids drawing chalk art too close to her sidewalk, like such actions were crimes against humanity. And one neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, a sweet old lady with a cane, told me that Karen once threatened to sue her for letting her cat sunbathe in the driveway, claiming the cat was creating heat glare that hurt property value, and I realized that this was bigger than me versus Karen. This was the entire neighborhood finally watching justice flatten entitlement like road spikes under a bulldozer track. So I thanked them, and they stayed to support because they knew Karen well enough to expect a dramatic counterattack at any moment, and they were right because soon enough the blinds in Karen's house twitched, and she burst out holding a USB flash drive high above her head screaming, "I have video proof of your crimes, and the HOA will convict you in a trial of absolute authority," and she ran straight to her laptop that she set up on a folding table in her yard, connecting it to a tiny projector like she was hosting a major press conference to expose the villainy of a man who dared to use his own driveway, and she pressed play on the first clip, proudly announcing Exhibit A, and the projector showed me standing on my driveway drinking coffee, and the crowd stared waiting for the scandal, but the footage was literally me sipping coffee peacefully, and Karen paused the clip dramatically explaining this shows him trespassing on HOA property with a beverage container of non-approved brand, and the silence that followed was only broken by a neighbor who yelled, "Karen, he is holding a Starbucks, not a bomb," and the entire audience burst out laughing so hard even the projector began shaking on the table. But Karen doubled down saying, "Well then Exhibit B will ruin him forever," and she played another clip of me walking next to the bulldozer checking the engine, and she paused again shouting, "See, this is unauthorized construction machinery within territorial limits of my grass," which made absolutely no sense because the bulldozer was 3 houses away from her grass, and the crowd laughed louder than before, and completely unfazed by her own humiliation Karen tried her final evidence, Exhibit C, which was a clip of the bulldozer crushing the spikes. Footage she clearly thought would be her jackpot piece, but halfway through the video the police car that had confronted her yesterday appeared in the frame, and the audience instantly remembered who got scolded by law enforcement last time, and her presentation crumbled faster than those spikes as neighbors pointed and whispered, "Wow, she actually recorded herself committing a crime," which made Karen panic and try to unplug the projector, but the cable tangled around her ankle, and she fell again with a shriek like the ground itself betrayed her, and as she scrambled up once again suddenly there was the loud sound of a squad car pulling up, and Karen's mood instantly flipped to thrilled confidence because she was certain this was her big moment where police would finally arrest me, but instead the officer rolled down the window, looked at Karen's whole mess of cameras, cones, and torn notice, and said, "Ma'am, we received multiple reports of an illegal road obstruction being reinstalled, and also complaints about a fake emergency siren noise." And Karen pointed at me screaming, "Arrest that bulldozer criminal, and take away his monstrous machine," but the officer looked directly at me and politely asked if everything was fine on my property, which made the audience cheer and Karen confused. So I calmly explained the situation and handed him Both the deed and the removal notice, while Karen threw her arms up yelling, "Don't believe him, he is a master manipulator of documents," but the officer ignored her tantrum and clearly stated, "Ma'am, you are not allowed to block this driveway. Install traps or park your vehicle here. This land belongs to him, and if you continue there will be fines followed by charges. Do you understand?" And Karen shook her head, refusing to accept reality, and screamed, "You will all regret this day. I will take this to the Supreme Court of Neighborhood Integrity, and make sure justice is served." She shouted that last part so loudly even birds flew away in fear before she stomped back inside, slamming the door again, leaving the officer to roll his eyes and drive away, knowing he'd likely be back soon because people like her run on unlimited bad decisions. And as the neighborhood settled down, I fired up the bulldozer once again, slowly revving the engine, while neighbors cheered louder and louder because they knew what came next. When the last barrier is gone, the project begins, and so I drove the bulldozer forward, proudly clearing the driveway once and for all, flattening the ground so perfectly it looked like the earth itself bowed down to the bulldozer, and as I parked it in front of the barn site, I felt unstoppable, like a hero, armed not with weapons but with patience that was almost gone because Karen still had fight in her, like a firecracker that refuses to burn out quietly, and I knew deep down she would return, not with reason, not with apologies, but with an even dumber plan that would shake the streets with chaos again before this war reached the perfect dramatic finale that everyone was waiting for. By the next morning it was obvious Karen had spent the entire night plotting, because the moment sunlight hit the neighborhood, she stormed out of her house wearing a camouflage jacket and a neon orange whistle around her neck, like some confused park ranger preparing for a wildlife encounter instead of a confrontation with a bulldozer, and in her hand she carried a massive binder labeled Operation Driveway Redemption, which she slammed dramatically onto a plastic table she had set up in the middle of her yard, like she was opening headquarters for the final battle. And she looked around with manic determination before yelling, "This is it, this neighborhood will finally understand the true meaning of law and order," and she marched toward my driveway blowing that whistle so aggressively the birds fled the trees, and even Princess Pink Sparkle took shelter under the porch, clearly embarrassed by her owner, and while she was in full delusion mode I was peacefully greasing the bulldozer tracks, enjoying my morning, when I heard her screaming, "Halt, halt, halt," to absolutely nobody, as she ran around setting up caution tape that drooped and sagged like wet noodles tied to lawn ornaments that could barely stand, and she planted a giant metal sign in the middle of the driveway that read "Dozer Free Zone" in marker that was already smudging under the sun, and I almost applauded her dedication to losing. But the true shock came when a moving truck arrived, driven by a bald guy in sunglasses, blasting rock music, and to my disbelief Karen ran to the truck waving frantically until the back door opened and 3 high school kids came out carrying wooden barricades and a giant inflatable traffic cone bigger than Karen herself, as she shouted, "Place the defenses here, boys, this driveway is now officially under HOA lockdown." And I leaned on the bulldozer watching this circus unfold as she commanded the kids to build a barricade empire, using every ridiculous object she could find: bags of mulch, stolen construction cones, inflatable yard reindeer left over from Christmas, garden chairs, and even a kiddie pool filled with water that she insisted would stop heavy machinery. And when one kid politely asked how a pool would stop a bulldozer, she snapped at him saying, "Because I said so," and the kids shrugged, clearly only there because she promised them money. And soon enough the entire driveway looked like a disaster-themed amusement park, and Karen stood proudly on top of a pile of buckets, waving a flashlight like a sword, declaring, "No trespassing, no metal beasts, no barn building, no happiness on my road," and the neighbors peeked out in complete awe of how far stupidity could stretch itself. And I calmly called Jake the tow guy again, telling him to grab popcorn because this was about to get entertaining, and he promised to stop by soon just to watch the meltdown. But the real moment of glory began when I climbed into the bulldozer and started the engine, sending a loud roar through the street like thunder, announcing the wrath of logic and property rights. And instantly Karen blew her whistle so hard her face turned tomato red, and she yelled, unauthorized movement, code orange," as if she had secret clearance for imaginary emergencies. and she ran right in front of the bulldozer holding her arms out yelling "You shall not pass" in the worst Gandalf impression the world has ever heard, while her inflatable cone army wobbled behind her, and I paused. Not because she could stop me, but because I wanted this moment to simmer in front of the cheering neighbors who were again gathering with lawn chairs, because who needs cable TV when Karen is your entertainment? And I called out calmly, "Karen, are you sure you want to stand in front of a bulldozer on property that is not yours?" And she screamed, "It is mine by rights of HOA Declaration 47B," which was a rule she definitely made up last night while watching random legal drama reruns, and she demanded I step down and surrender my keys and sign a contract giving her controlling access to the driveway, and I asked her one more time out of pure politeness to move. But instead she doubled down screaming, "I am the gatekeeper of this neighborhood, and nobody crosses without my permission," before she blew the whistle directly into my face, thinking loud noise would intimidate a man sitting inside 10 tons of steel. And since she refused to move, I gripped the controls and inched forward, slowly letting the dozer tracks roll until they gently tapped the first barricade, a single folding chair, which flew backward like a paper airplane, causing neighbors to laugh so hard they nearly fell over, and Karen screamed like she just watched her child get eaten by wolves. Then I pushed forward a bit more, crunching through the bags of mulch, sending dirt flying everywhere, and before Karen could react I lightly nudged the inflatable traffic cone, which rolled away dramatically, bouncing off her fences, and it was easily the most pathetic defense collapse in history, and suddenly Karen realized she was in danger, and she screamed, "Retreat, retreat," as she panicked backwards, slipping and falling into the kiddie pool, which burst like a water balloon, soaking her completely, while Princess Pink Sparkle barked furiously, as if demanding to know what life choices led them here, and the barricades fell one after another like dominoes, chairs snapped, plastic cracked, and reindeer flew through the air in a glorious display of gravity, proving the bulldozer was the true ruler of this road. And while the audience roared with laughter, Karen scrambled out of the water, crawling away while yelling, "Stop, stop, stop, before I call the National Guard and UN peacekeepers and YouTube customer service," because she was running out of agencies to threaten me with. But I continued clearing the driveway peacefully, because despite the chaos my goal was simple: to regain my path and ensure the barn project moved forward. And when the last barricade was crushed, I parked the bulldozer right next to her ruined kid pool, and stepped out, looking down at her soaked grass-covered self, shaking like a chihuahua, and I calmly said, "This all ends when you accept the truth. You cannot block what does not belong to you." And she weakly stood up, dripping and trembling, saying, "You think this is over, you think you won, but this is only the beginning," and she pointed toward her house, where she claimed the HOA president himself was coming this afternoon to shut me down forever, and to that I simply smiled, because I already knew the president very well, a reasonable man who hated Karen's nonsense more than anyone else. And as she stormed inside planning the next disaster, I looked toward the barn site, knowing the final showdown would be today, and when that HOA president arrived, the entire truth would explode in Karen's face, louder than any whistle she could ever blow. The sun was high in the sky when the HOA president finally arrived, a man named Mr. Benson, who Karen always described as her closest ally and the iron fist of community rules, but the moment he stepped out of his car it became crystal clear that he was here for business, not for Karen's fantasy crusade, because he looked exhausted, annoyed, and already fed up with whatever chaos she had dragged him into, and Karen burst out her front door like a rocket, sprinting toward him, screaming, "You came just in time. Stop the bulldozer, outlaw, before he destroys everything beautiful about this neighborhood." And she pointed dramatically at me like I was a villain from a silent movie, even though all I was doing was checking the bulldozer engine while sipping iced tea. And Mr. Benson held up his hand, telling her to calm down for the first time in human history, which stunned the neighbors watching, because Karen calming down was like expecting a volcano to take a nap. But she tried anyway, taking rapid, heavy breaths while still glaring at me like I had set her lawn on fire, and he asked her to explain the situation clearly and without yelling, and she immediately yelled anyway, saying he is destroying community property and brought a war machine into a peaceful neighborhood and installed an illegal barn to traffic dangerous livestock and spy on the community. And as she talked faster and faster, she tripped over every lie she had ever told. contradicting herself in a spiral of nonsense before he finally snapped and said, "Karen, stop, we have told you 1,000 times his land is not part of this HOA, and you have absolutely zero jurisdiction here." And her face froze like a glitching computer screen while he turned toward me and apologized for the inconvenience she caused, saying he already spoke to the police and confirmed everything on record including the driveway parcel, and that she has been repeatedly warned to leave me alone. And the crowd began clapping again, relieved that justice was standing tall and Karen's collapsing empire was falling brick by imaginary brick. But she refused to accept defeat, grabbing Mr. Benson's arm, begging him to reconsider, telling him that I was manipulating everyone with fake documents and hypnotic bulldozer noises, and she begged him to issue a full HOA blockade authorized by her emergency bylaws, but he put his foot down, stating bluntly that she does not have any authority to invent bylaws, especially ones written in scented glitter pen, and she screamed betrayal. "You are supposed to be on my side, not his. You are supposed to protect the neighborhood from his evil barn doom plan." And he asked her seriously, "Did you really call me here over a barn and a driveway after lying to me that he was building a hazardous waste dump?" And Karen stuttered, trying to salvage her delusion, saying the barn will attract crime cows, hooligan cows, wild country cows that will poop everywhere, making this place a disaster. And the silence that followed was priceless, because even Princess Pink Sparkle face palmed with her paw. And Mr. Benson turned to me again and said, "If you want, we can file an official complaint against her and take this to the county, which she may not enjoy very much considering the evidence against her is overwhelming. But I had a better plan, something that would end this battle once and for all, while making sure her consequences came with poetic justice, so I stepped forward and said, no need for courts, I already created a solution." And everyone leaned in curious as I announced that starting today I was installing a new access control system for the driveway specifically for Karen, since the road technically belonged to me and I could lawfully regulate who uses it. And I pulled out a shiny metal sign from behind the bulldozer that read, "Driveway access fee $200 PR pass for trespassers and HOA officials." And the entire neighborhood exploded with laughter, while Karen shrieked that this was extortion and illegal and immoral and a threat to her travel freedom. But Mr. Benson calmly told her that it was perfectly legal, since she had no rights to use the driveway without my permission, and if she did not want to pay the fee, she could simply take the long road around, which was an extra 10 minutes of bumpy adventure that she had always avoided like the plague. And she screamed that she would never take that disgusting dirt road, and demanded I show mercy because she was late for her weekly salon appointment. And the world did not revolve around my property line games, but I reminded her of the many mornings she made me late by blocking my driveway with spikes, chains, cones, or her SUV, and said gently, "Maybe the dirt road will help you appreciate convenience more." And her jaw quivered like she was about to cry again, as she realized the power shift had finally landed squarely against her, and she stormed toward her garage furious, slamming the door as if it could erase reality. But a minute later her SUV returned, hooked to Jake's tow truck because he had kindly brought it back and parked it in the proper legal spot on her lawn, and she rushed to pay him off angrily, then jumped into her car, trying to speed past the crowd toward the driveway exit. But I stepped in front, holding up the new sign, and said, "$200 please," and she froze with the precision of a statue, glaring at me before jerking the wheel angrily and peeling away toward the long route, tires kicking dust everywhere, while neighbors cheered goodbye. Karen, enjoy nature. And one guy shouted, "Don't forget the cows," which made her shout something I'm pretty sure was not neighborly love. And as she disappeared down the dusty trail, Mr. Benson laughed, saying he had never seen such a flawless victory in all his years of HOA service, and he shook my hand, relieved to finally see someone stand up against the tyrant of tulips and rulebook madness that she had become. And from that day forward the barn project flourished. Workers arrived, volunteers joined, kids smiled, families gathered, and everyone helped hammer, paint, and build something that actually benefited people instead of hurting them, unlike Karen's failed attempts at dictatorship. And whenever the bulldozer rolled, Neighbors clapped because it had become more than a machine. It was a symbol that the neighborhood belonged to the community, not to the iron grip of one overbearing woman who confused power with paranoia. And the best part of all was the final surprise that arrived in her mailbox a month later: a hefty bill issued by the county for illegally installing spikes cameras and road obstructions on private land, along with warnings for repeated false reports to authorities and citations from the tow company for obstructing a towing operation. And she went nearly silent after that, barely seen outside, except on rare mornings where she would quietly drive the long dirt road, avoiding everyone's eyes like a humbled monarch stripped of her crown, though every once in a while she would glare over from her yard at my bulldozer as it rested proudly near the completed barn, as if plotting another attempt. But her fear of fines and humiliation always held her back, and now the barn stands tall, filled with laughter, tools, and community projects, while the driveway remains clear, smooth, and free of spikes, inflatable cones, and kiddie pools. And whenever someone new visits and asks why the bulldozer has a painted sign on its side that reads "Justice on Tracks," the neighbors smile and say, "Let us tell you the story of Karen and the driveway she never owned." And we all laugh together, because in the end the truth crushed the lies, just like those spikes under steel. And the best revenge was not the crushing or the towing or the driveway fee, even though those were fun. The best revenge was the peaceful community, restored, stronger, united, and finally free from the reign of the unstoppable HOA Karen.